Well, this powerful vision statement of Jesus, for many of us, sums up why we do the things we do as Christians. God is still speaking, and we are still listening to the call of this great commission of Jesus to go and make disciples of all the nations. We in the United Church of Christ especially see ourselves as a church that is united and uniting, a church that was formed in the 1950s of two primary denominations, one which was made up of the descendants of Germans and one that was made primarily of the descendants of English. That was a bold thing to do only a few years after the end of World War II. And even today, this church is known for extending an extravagant welcome to outcasts and strangers. This is why we go out into the world to bear witness to the good news of God's love. We are called as peddlers of hope to the hopeless, but we don't generally in our churches hold tent revivals or thump the Bible very much. These days at our end of the Christian spectrum, we're not so much going out and baptizing heathen folk as our foremothers and forefathers did, even from this church, as the Ruggles set out for Hawaii from this very location to be the first white missionaries in Hawaii. Instead, we are more likely to be out in the world proclaiming the gospel with our actions. We are very much a church that responds to the call of St. Francis, who said, Christians should preach the gospel at all times, and when necessary, use words. We are busy, hardworking Christians who are always taking on projects that people who don't quite catch this global vision of Jesus in Matthew might dismiss as none of their business because they don't see it as having anything to do with themselves, their personal morality, or their immediate family. We build homes for low-income strangers as we celebrate the dedication of our Brookfield Habitat House now. We resettle refugee families from overseas, like Nafi, Suhair, and Mutaz from Iraq, and Annie and Lloyd before from West Africa. We send mission trips out to the Dominican Republic, to Florida, to West Virginia, and then this year to New Orleans to rebuild wrecked and run-down houses and shattered lives. We share our space with the Danbury Chinese Alliance Church, and they give back generously to our ministries with their offerings in support of us. We are in mission partnership throughout the United Church of Christ with congregations across the world. Most are predominantly filled with those of European ancestry, but there are also Chinese and Japanese American churches, African American churches, Native American churches, Pacific Islander churches. Through the eyes of God, we are called to see one another as one family, no matter what our national origin or the color of our skin or the tilt of our politics. We are called to just see the mud of holy creation on each of our faces and remember the tender touch of the hands of the God who created us, who made each one of us and calls us together to live as his body in this broken world. Well, that brings us to today's lectionary text from the first two chapters of Genesis, which I decided to not read in its entirety before the sermon because it takes about 5 or 10 minutes. I'm guessing, besides that, you may have heard it before, but if you're unfamiliar with it, it is on page 1 of your pew Bibles. In the beginning, it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and the darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving across the face of the waters. This is some of the most beautiful poetry in the entire Bible, and I really dearly love it. I regret that Christian fundamentalists have nearly stolen it from us by insisting it must be creation science. I believe that you can really ruin Genesis if you try to make it into a factual historical account. I think, though, that no myth could better capture the truth of our reality here on planet Earth, because Genesis tells us in no uncertain terms that we are all one family, that we are all descended from a common ancestor, Adam. Genesis 1 holds a powerful affirmation of our common humanity in verse 27, where it says, "So God created man," or humanity. Some new translations even say earthlings, because the Hebrew word Adam comes from Adamah, which literally means the earth or the ground, the substance of creation. So God created earthlings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. This was revolutionary thinking. All humanity in the image of God, all humanity, even slaves, even foreigners, even women. This idea was both illogical and dangerous to many great minds of the ancient world. It was obvious to most ancient peoples that great kings and heroes were created in the image of God. But if the king's slave or one of the king's concubines was in the image of God, there were serious political implications to that. You see, Genesis flew in the face of conventional wisdom back when it was written during the Babylonian exile, just some 500 years before Christ. Even though it's first in our Bibles, it was not first written text of Holy Scripture. And the world back then, much like the world today, tended to believe that might makes right. In other words, if you wanted to know which nation had the true religion, you could just look to see which nation was the most successful politically, the one that had the most military success. And it was clearly to people that nation that the gods had most blessed. That people had the true religion. And Babylon, after all, had its own creation myth. Babylon, the conquering nation of the day, where the Jews were taken in chains to be oppressed. Babylon had this story of how the sword-wielding Marduk, the hero, creates the world by slicing open the belly of the pregnant goddess Tiamat. Humanity then sprang forth from her spattered blood upon the ground, and the kings of Babylon were descended from the line of Marduk, the slayer. In that worldview, people all knew their place. They knew they were only insignificant flecks of blood flung to the ground from the tip of their great ruler and emperor's sword. So the Jews then, as this oppressed race of second-class citizens in what is today Iraq, told a different story around their tables to their children. They shaped a profoundly different worldview that endures to this day. It is our heritage. In the second creation account, which follows in chapter 2, humanity springs up from the ground, but in a much, much, much different way.